about a year ago, November 2016, there were some discussions around the A&D activity, and that there was really not a lot of guidelines, not a lot of checklists, not a lot of formality in how different organizations helped manage the information flow during an acquisition or divestiture. And we had the forum. We've then been doing the knowledge events for about 4.5 years, and we thought, what a perfect opportunity for us to look at, let me see if I can get that off. What a perfect opportunity for us to bring the industry together and talk about this issue that seemed to exist, and maybe find through industry collaboration some ways to address that. And so we thought maybe developing a playbook would be a good idea at the time. So what we did is we hosted a series of knowledge events across North America. So many of you participated with those knowledge events here in Calgary. We hosted several knowledge events in Denver. We did some in Texas, in Houston, and Dallas, and basically heard the same theme throughout the entire industry, that there really wasn't the guidelines. We got a lot of good information, a lot of good collaboration from a lot of different organizations on developing the playbook. What that looked like is we had about 30 different organizations participate. We had over 40 individuals from those organizations participate, and 500 plus hours were spent when we look at how many sessions we had and how much time was spent during each session in these discussions and collaboration. So the playbook that's in front of you at the table today really is a collaboration of individuals like yourselves that help develop the playbook itself, and we just helped facilitate and kind of put all that information together and formalize it into the playbook going forward. So a couple things that came out of that is there was really 4 main stages in an acquisition divestiture. You've got the pre-deal stage, you've got the deal stage, you've got the close stage, and you've got the post-deal stage. And what you'll find in the playbook is each one of those stages is broken down with a lot of detail and what to look for, what are some of the critical issues in there, what are some of the critical components that you want to pay attention to. The content in that is broken down to, what are some tips? What are some key tips and points you want to pay attention to? What are some checklists? What are some things that you need to methodically look at and go through when you're in the middle of one of these phases? What are some of the best practices that you want to try to implement? And frankly, we heard a lot of worst practices as we went through it too. And that was helpful too, to just kind of call out what should be the best practices. And then what are some of the key challenges that pretty much every organization faces when they're in the middle of these stages, okay? And how to handle those. So a little bit of a teaser. So to give you an example, this is just one little snippet of a section in there during the pre-deal. One of the challenges is being in the know, okay? A lot of times, as a lot of you know, you don't find out about the acquisition until it's way down the road, okay? And so what came out of a lot of the sessions was, boy, if we could just get introduced a little bit earlier and understand the dynamics of the acquisition. As an organization that we're buying, where they tend to buy and flip assets quite a bit, well, they're not going to spend the time and effort to go through and convert the information, convert the records. They're not going to spend a lot of time on it. So that puts more onus on the acquiring organization to really do some due diligence and see what they're getting a hold of and what might need to be done with it once it arrives. As opposed to an organization that maybe has spent a little bit more time with that, has cleaned up the information, the data, and the records, whereby you're getting a much better set of information. The other thing is, and this was a really interesting point that came up in almost every city, was the organizations that appointed an A&D coordinator had a much, much higher degree of success throughout the acquisition. And they were really that key link and liaison throughout all of the phases of the A&D activity, and linking in all the different stakeholders, departments, and components to that, and just making sure the communication was clear. Everybody understood what their role and responsibility was throughout the organization, and it just made it much, much smoother. So that was something that came through in almost all of the sessions that we had. So a little bit of a teaser, but those are the kinds of things that you'll find embedded throughout the playbook as we go forward. So a couple of common themes. One is why management and key stakeholders buy-in is essential, and how to achieve it. Okay, that was one of the things that came up in almost all the sessions as well, is we need the key stakeholders to buy into it. How do I do that? It's not easy. So there's some tactics, there's some ideas, there's some thoughts on how to get that done inside the playbook. How do I get to the table earlier? That was a big piece too, is, sometimes I find out, when it's way down the road, or the information just kind of shows up on the dock, right? And now what do I do? How do I handle it? So getting to the table earlier. And then finally, how do I help demonstrate return on investment with some of these things that we need to do with the information as we start to integrate it? How can I demonstrate back to my organization that there is a return on this? So there's lots of ideas, thoughts, and concepts inside the playbook for that. So I hope you all enjoy it. I hope you find it as a useful tool. We're going to go forward now with the panel. So let's talk about the playbook a little bit more, have the panel engage in some questions, and hopefully everybody participate in some of the questions. But again, thank you very much for coming.
One of the greatest struggles of records and information management professionals is getting engaged early in the A&D process, as Chuck mentioned. It was a very hot topic of conversation, and really one of the key drivers of kind of how we move forward with developing the playbook. Ideally, you want to get engaged at the pre-deal stage. Doesn't often happen, but best spot to be. Companies often do not realize the value that RIM can bring to the table, and the best way to demonstrate this value is to equate it to the organization's bottom line. There is a cost to managing information effectively, but much larger costs with risks associated with mismanagement. The key is to get engaged with the internal stakeholders to understand their business and workflow long before the event. Providing sound records information management advice to improve processes and reduce costs demonstrates your value and will help ensure success at getting entrenched early in the process. It is essential to lay the groundwork early on, not when the event occurs. So the first topic, key topic that Chuck had mentioned in the final slide, was why management and key stakeholder buy-in is essential and how to achieve it. Probably the biggest question, conversation, some tips that we were providing in there, a lot of notes with regards to the playbook. But what are the best practices for building buy-in? And I think, Miles, you certainly had a lot of key points that were made as we were developing the playbook. So I'm going to actually go to you first and get some of your thoughts.
Okay, I'm not going to pretend to know everything. I can only speak from personal experience. We are at the table early and have been for quite some time. So the way that happened is it actually wasn't A&D specific. It has to happen much earlier than that. So when you're building your overall IM program, you need to do three things. And the very first thing before you do even that is stop presenting yourself from a records perspective first. You really have to take yourself outside of that and come at it more from a business angle. You'll get much more engagement earlier and you'll get much more credibility earlier if you do that. So how do you do that? You really have to focus on the three things that are the most important to the business first. That's time, money, and risk. So what you do for each of those three things, I would say right out of the gate, from a time perspective, you have to develop procedures and a process and a relationship that's as easy or easier than what they're doing today. Otherwise, you're just not going to get buy-in. So it's really all about what's in it for them, right? So you have to sell it from that perspective. From a money perspective, I don't know how everybody's company works, but for us, we have performance assessments. Everybody are evaluated on that throughout the year. That goes both for information management and other disciplines. So what we did early on is we started to phrase it in terms of what can we help you with to make you look better on your performance assessment, right? So at the end of the day, that hits them on the bottom line personally. So now they have a personal investment in it. The third thing would be from a risk perspective. So, you get a lot of questions around, why should I do this? Why should I care? Why should I even be talking to you? I'm too busy, et cetera, et cetera. We've heard all this, right? So really, you have to describe it in terms of risk. And by that I mean, okay, so why would you comply with our program? Why would you work with us? Because in the course of the business activity that person's involved in, the record that they create or the records that they work with is for a specific function. And that's what they're focused on. That's what they're paid for. What you have to do is ask them to think about what happens outside of that immediate transaction. So when you're done with it, who's going to manage if it needs to be audited? If you go into a discovery situation, if you're doing a divestiture or an acquisition, and quite often those people have nothing to do with those processes. But now they start to realize that they have an obligation that's larger than their immediate task. And that's where you start to engage them and say, you know what? I don't want my name attached to this. And it turns out down the road, they couldn't locate this information or it was mismanaged or whatever. So you put a little bit of the fear into them, and then it kind of brings it home for them. So those are 3 ways to personalize it for them. And then that just kind of spreads if you take that common approach with everyone. And then, of course, when you get to the A&D side, if that relationship and that understanding is already established, it makes it much easier to have that conversation about getting involved in the process earlier.
But it is difficult to get people out of the way they're used to doing things, especially when they've been doing it for years or decades, and with the same company for possibly years or decades. So that whole change management piece is very crucial and usually very difficult to achieve. In fact, Lisa, we were talking a little bit actually over breakfast, and not necessarily directly related to, say, A&D or certain events, but corporate change and kind of this is the way the new world is, and it's not just so simple to say, okay, this is the way it is, so go do it. Further thoughts, I guess, as to what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, so building upon what Miles shared, and Miles, you took everything I was going to say. No. If you're working on your relationship in terms of the importance of records management, just going into an A&D scenario, it's probably too late. Not to say you shouldn't do it, but you need to have been doing that all along. So if I can ask this group, who has a sponsor at the C-suite around records management? Not too many hands. So that's one of the key things to think about. Is there a sponsor at the C-suite level that gets record management, that gets information management, that understands it as a corporate asset? Usually that's a legal, that's a counsel, that might be counsel, that might be your CFO, there might be a regulatory individual. But do you have a sponsor who can speak in C-suite language about what Miles has mentioned, the consequences of not having your information in order? Do you know who your champions are on the ground? Yeah. Sorry, so at the senior level, and I think there's David's probably going to talk about this in terms of the return on investment and the things that the senior level cares about. So they care about what Miles talked about. Is this reducing cost? What's the return on investment? Is this reducing our risk as an organization? Is this helping our reputation? In my experience, a lot of times when companies have reputational issues, you can track it to a process, a practice, a policy that either wasn't there or that wasn't being followed. And this whole information management area is rife with potential to impact a company's reputation. So it's a sponsor at that level to be able to talk to their peer group to say, guys, we got to care about information management. It's a corporate asset and we need to be thinking about it. So that's on one level. And then on the other level, and in my experience with records management, you often have a number of champions throughout the organization. And they may or may not have formal roles in information management or records management. Your admin people, your project managers, there's people throughout the organization that also get the importance of information management and are sometimes struggling to figure out, well, what do I do with this? I know it's important, but what do I do with this? So thinking about that, those champions and utilizing and leveraging those champions to help you build the importance and the relevancy of information management. Can I just make one more point there?
Please.
The other piece is any one of us, when we get deep subject matter experts and you get deep subject matter expertise in an area, you will sometimes make assumptions that the stakeholders I'm talking with, the stakeholders that need to understand this, have this fundamental knowledge. And I can tell you, I am not a records management professional in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I'm probably your worst nightmare because I'm pushing back going, why do I need to do that? I'm so busy and I'm into relationships, not all this record stuff. But even the fundamentals, when does information become a record? As someone who's not in that field, I don't know. I don't know what I should keep for how long. I don't understand the implications of that. So it's important to not, to make sure that you're actually in an educational role to some degree as well. So not just doing all the busy stuff that you need to do, but also thinking about how am I educating the people who are actually going to execute in their areas the records management policies and procedures and practices. Am I helping them understand even some of the fundamentals?
Yeah, you brought up ROI, which is certainly one of the key points on the last slide that Chuck presented with the Playbook. And it is very difficult to try and capture that, especially from the information management world. And most were decentralized. There's many different types of administrators that are doing many different types of tasks. It's not a full-time job that maybe they're applying their day to information management pieces. And trying to actually, as one of maybe the change people that maybe is the information manager or IT, how do you start to get a hold of that ROI, and then how do you start to have those intelligent conversations? It is a very difficult thing to do. And David, I don't know if you can maybe feed in a little bit as to
Sure.
what some of those intelligent conversations and what you would someone to come to you and okay, this is I'm pitching, trying to change our world, because it needs to actually get pitched and then pushed back down to really start to drive that change.
Sure. So, maybe just to work off where Lisa was going, one of the key things that we start to help or assist companies with is around leadership and determining whether or not someone has an executive sponsor. That is extremely key. The second thing along with that is a structure, a governance structure around how the data would be managed. That structure needs to be in place to ensure kind of effective and regular communication, accountability for the records and data, and how the resource and data will be available to people so that they can use it after. Where this all leads to, in my mind, is where I to determine ROI and to have that measured effectively, I break it down into two things on how we help companies. And the first one is on risk and I would say compliance. Anything that is going to help companies avoid fines, penalties, reputational risk, things like that. Those things, can be measured. They're not necessarily an ROI, but avoidance of penalties, interest, and things like that are key. So we try to, when we're assessing in an A&D scenario, that's the first piece that we go to, is to make sure, because I would say that any C-suite is going to get quite upset if in an A&D situation the first thing you have to do is pay a fine and penalty because of some sort of compliance risk. The second piece then, or the second, where we look at is around decision support. So decision support is a broad category, which we would say you would have to identify all the data and records, which is going to enable the company after an A&D to do what they need to do to actually monetize and get the value of the asset or company that they've acquired. The only way to do that is back to Miles's point, is that has to be clearly articulated around why you're doing the deal, why are you buying the asset, why are you doing the merger, why are you buying that. And those reasons have to be clearly articulated, and the metrics should be articulated up front. And it's usually really easy to get to, because when someone has to make a proposal to get those funds to do the transaction, they have to justify the reasons of why they're doing so. So those reasons are clearly articulated. The problem is that those reasons aren't then articulated to the business. And I mean all various levels of the business. So to get ROI, those reasons then have to be part of the platform so that people know that if this is the value, the reasons why we bought it, then this is how we're going to go and get it. And so we promote education we're big into making sure that those deal value metrics aren't just in finance, where I sit usually, but it sits in land, legal, HR. All the departments have to know the rationale around why deals happen.
And that's, I think, where most of us see that communication or that thought process, or why is the deal being done, doesn't get filtered down, and it doesn't get communicated within how do you manage that information. And a lot of us experience that when we bring in acquisitions, and basically there's no money tied to try and clean it up, which is, I mean, one of the key factors in trying to get engaged early, to have a look at what that information is, how you're receiving it, how does it relate to how we have structured our business, both physically and digitally. So again, just circling back to that kind of ROI, those intelligent conversations, getting buy-in. It's still that big mystery, and it's almost circular, it seems like, with regards to not being able to get up, and then the communication not being able to come down and have it all kind of sync together. Miles, was there any kind of thoughts kind of how all that ties together?
Yeah, I think in talking to many people in Calgary, and I imagine it's the same in Denver and in Texas and whatnot, but again, you have to look at it from your audience side. So if you're talking to senior management, they're living in a very different world than you are day to day. So the way things are going, especially in the energy industry, it used to be all about how much production can I get done in a day. Now it seems like we've gone much more to a shift in what are the shareholders thinking? What does the company value? So how do you draw that line between that level of thought and that world to what you're doing in the records and information management space? And it's like everything else. I think it's a formula. So what you have to do is just say, okay, so what is records and information management to begin with before you even get into A&D? And I think for the most part, the perception is that it's G&A overhead. It's a group that doesn't actually make a lot of money for the company, so it's always kind of pushed over to the side, and it's treated as an other, right? So it's an administrative function. I think it was mentioned earlier that really what you have to do is change their way of thinking to say, no, the information itself is actually part of the asset that you're selling. It's not something that's separate from that. And a lot of times a company is literally purchasing that information along with the asset. They can't operate the asset without the information. So I think it's a mental shift to recognizing that first. Then once you've done that, it's really saying, okay, so if this is really just a G&A cost, tell me what's in it for me financially from that perspective. And you would say, well, it's typically a G&A cost that's hidden, right? It's buried. Nobody really has any visibility, including the information management group, to how much money is it actually costing you to operate on a day-to-day basis. So if you can figure that out, and that's largely through your metrics, and that's another conversation of how you're able to actually do that. But if you're actually able to feed those metrics and those cost savings back up the chain, what happens is they start to see, oh, this is a bunch of money that we're spending that we're not even aware of. If we had that money, what we're going to do today is probably redistribute it into our capital program, which then means we're going to be drilling more wells, we're going to be doing more business, and then in turn, your shareholders view that as, oh, they're a healthy organization. They're actually going to do more than they said they're going to do, and it's all about perception in the shareholder community, right? So you can start to see how that trickles down to what you're doing, and I think that's the connection you have to make, and then ultimately you work on how you're going to develop those metrics and calculate those cost savings. But that's really the conversation that you're having at that high level.
And it is, because what really helps is actual real examples.
Exactly.
Are there kind of real examples that all of you can kind of share to say, okay, this was sort of the event, or this is what was going on within this corporation. This is kind of how we were able to actually maneuver.
Can I build on both what I've heard here in terms of conversation and communication? So you really need to align your work to a strategic or business imperative. So whether that's operational excellence, whether that's avoidance of risk, whether that's compliance with regulatory and legal laws, how is what you do as a function aligned to a strategic or business imperative? The other piece is that, and because we get into our worlds and we're very focused on getting our stuff done, we don't always understand the workflows and the issues and challenges faced by the businesses. So I would recommend that you get a little bit more comfortable with that and work and think about collaboration and understanding what their needs are as well, because that will help you to communicate about those examples and what Miles was talking about, and think about it from a storytelling perspective. I'm sorry, but this area can be a little dry for people, for those outside of this area. And so you need to think about it from a storytelling perspective. How do I make records management relatable and relevant to the business and to their needs and to their workflow? What are those examples? What are some powerful questions I can ask? A good one is, so do you guys know, so if you said to the business or to the C-suite, do you know that if a regulator came to us tomorrow and said, we need to pull a number of records to demonstrate compliance in a certain area, that we actually are not sure we could do it? That's going to be something that people can relate to. So think about that, even in that communication piece.
Does that resonate with everyone? Like, are you having conversations around compliance and risk? Does it actually get responded to from kind of senior level as like, yeah, we get it, we understand it, we want to address it, so talk to me more about how we do that? Or is it more just kind of brushed away and yeah, I think we pretty much got it handled? Nobody has really the conversations or any feedback? Real life examples?
Yeah, I think risk and compliance are obvious examples, and I think everybody gets that, and I think that's easy to communicate. The financial benefits are maybe a little bit more difficult to communicate, but I'll give you one example that so we were so far into our program, we were building those relationships, building that credibility, and we were already down that path before we really needed to kick it up a notch and getting involved in the A&D process. But really, our position was we were at the end of the line, right? So if a deal was done, if a divestiture was done, we were the ones being asked to collect the records, as many of you do, and send it out the door. One day I asked, where did this list come from? Where did the schedule come from? And nobody could tell me. I asked 5 different people in 5 different departments. They all had different versions of the list. And you've got 5 different departments telling you to send this stuff out the door yesterday. So that puts you in a very, very difficult position, because you're at risk of sending information that you shouldn't be. You're at risk of not sending information that you should be. There's an urgency on the other end. We need this stuff right away. You've got your operations guys. They want to get working on these wells like within days of the deal closing, right? You can appreciate where they're coming from, but it puts you in a very, very difficult position. So the way that we kind of got involved earlier at the table was from the data side, actually. So not from the documents and records side, but what are your data sources for creating these schedules? And what's the methodology going into that? And that was really opening a big can of worms, but bringing that up to the management level attention, what we were finding is the data was so conflicting that we were actually, in some cases, potentially selling wells that were reclaimed, which you actually can't do in Alberta technically, or selling wells that you didn't even own is ridiculous, right? So, management's looking at you going, is this for real? Are you, and looking around the table and everybody's kind of looking at their shoes going, yeah. So, okay, we have to do something about this, right? So it was really getting on top of that process first and getting that under control. And that's a risk to your reputation, but it's also a risk to your operations and everything else. And that's outside of the actual, when it hits compliance, right? So that's why you really need to be diligent early on in the process, because that, that kind of risk just starts very early on in the chain. And if you go through all that, as most people do, without having a good handle on your data, those compliance and regulatory risks are going to come out in the end anyways. Then you've got your purchaser calling you and saying, what's going on, right? The other specific example that I saw is on the acquisition end, because information management's often not aware of the deal until they're actually receiving the records. You're unpacking them, you're putting them in. For whatever reason, one day I was taking in a bunch of pipeline records, and I opened it up and I looked and I looked it up on the regulatory database, and the substance flowing through that line was actually sour gas, but the company we had purchased from had actually classified it as sweet gas. Big difference, big regulatory difference. So as I started looking into this, I passed it on to our facilities engineers. And because those guys weren't involved early in the process, we had a huge compliance risk now on our hands. So that's, we don't always have time when these deals are closing because the intensity is on getting the deal closed. I don't think all of the risk is being evaluated, not even just from a records perspective, but just from an operations perspective. And then it becomes a big mess, right? So now that's damaging your reputation as well as costing you regulatory compliance points and additional costs and so on and so on. So those are some real life examples that I've seen.
So what transitioned in Canada from the way they used to do things, the way they used to operate, to then probably, what, a decade ago is when it started?
Yeah.
Which is really, no one else, this there was talk, but no one else was really going down that road.
Right.
What was the catalyst? What really changed the view or the drive to...
I think it had been going on for many years, and really I just hit a nerve. I was just the guy that, stood in front of the bus and took the hit and said, we're not doing our due diligence up front. Our business development department and whoever else was involved would white map an area, and this is a common practice, right? They'd white map the area, but then they wouldn't go the level down to actually do their due diligence to say, what assets are we partners on? Which ones do we own? What's the nature of the relationships of this area? And it's just everything's on the block, right? So I think questioning that process was part of it. The other part was actually more within our land space where as I asked more questions, I could see I was cutting off more people. So I was not building relationships, but I was asking, I'm seeing in our different systems that it's saying that we have different levels of working interest. I don't understand what that means. From a records perspective, I would always ask, is this 100% sale or acquisition, or is it somewhere in between? And I could never get a straight answer because a lot of the people involved often didn't know the answer, or they were taught or trained to look at a specific system, and they would go to that as their source of truth when in fact it could be wrong. And that's just a training, and that's just how things evolved over the years. If you amalgamate companies or you do acquisitions, you're bringing in all these different opinions on how things should be done, but there's never kind of a level set consistency that says, hey, this actually is wrong. So, getting a system in place where we reconciled our data and said, this is the source of truth for this piece of information, this is the source for that, bringing it together in an automated sort of way, rather than what was happening is people would generate spreadsheets, right? They'd be copying information from different systems and doing all of this manual work to reconcile it all. And then a week later, that would all change anyways because it wasn't live data. So, it was riddled with issues, and I think it was everybody getting at the table and sitting down and saying, how are we going to resolve that first? And then I think, everybody from the different disciplines participating in that built some trust amongst themselves because we all agreed on a common approach.
Can I build on that a little
Please.
bit? So that is one of the core pieces moving forward, is to think about what are those standards, especially when you're bringing together companies who are, everyone's doing something differently. And then how do I make it easy or as easy as possible for people to actually adhere to those standards, whether those are templates and practices and some training. But the other thing to consider is the whole cultural piece. So within your organization, you have a culture, but guess what? You actually have different cultures in different business units in different areas. So some of your corporate culture will be quite accustomed to rules, policies, legal, finance, regulatory, very accustomed, oh yeah, I get it. There's rules, there's standards, I get it. Other groups, your land agents, your BD guys, many other of those groups are relationship based. So what they can sometimes see standards and rules and permissions and all of those things that are important in the records management world just as getting in their way of being able to do their jobs. So you need to think about that, the culture piece, not only within your own organizations, but in an acquisition perspective. What kinds of culture are you bringing in, and what work do you have to do to get everyone working towards those certain standards?
David, how important is corporate culture in the conversations with the people that you're dealing with?
Yeah, I would say it's critical because in an A&D situation, you're dealing with obviously two different cultures, and so one of the biggest things that we see as a failure is, we're talking about records management and data that gets acquired, but also you're acquiring the people potentially that use those records and data. I find it odd in this day and age. I know that one of the key things around A&D is around synergies, and one of the easiest things is around head count. So it's an easy thing to whack to get a synergy and make a deal better. But what I think is a critical failure by companies is when they bring the people over that have access to and knowledge of key records and data and how that actually interfaced in the old company is that learning and that education about showing the purchaser how that data was used. There could be lessons learned, there could be nuances. Obviously people and companies run data and records management differently. My company will be different from Miles' different company. So I think it's very interesting that people cut people, or that if the culture doesn't assimilate those people into the acquired company, that those people leave. One of the bigger areas that we're also involved in is not only on the integration of people and data into the company, but what happens is when those people leave the company fairly under short notice and voluntarily leave, what are they taking with them? So now you're bringing into an element of fraud. You're bringing into people believe that information, data, maybe they had some element of creating that. They go and create another company, or that information leaves the building. I was in one particular deal with a very well-known chairman who basically said that if I find out that any offsetting wells are happening on our deal by a recently departed person or persons, we will sue each and every one of those people. So it's a big issue that when companies are putting a lot of money into those situations, I think that the culture has to not only embrace the information, but it has to embrace the people that control that information.
Okay. And unlike other assets, if you're looking at information management as a corporate asset, you have to think about the whole knowledge transfer piece.
So what we'd like to give is a little bit more details that everyone can take away. The playbook definitely has some tips, some suggestions, a lot of good information. But when it comes to each of your worlds and where you live, or the companies and the history that you have with some of the companies you work with, what are some key things that everyone here can maybe take away so that they can start tomorrow to drive change? Pretty broad question.
I think the earliest thing that you have to work on is defining what those metrics are in your formula for the cost savings, because that's not only going to help you in A&D, but that's going to help you in your program too. And ideally, any A&D activity is going to roll up into the same scorecard or metrics as your day-to-day activities as well, just to provide the overall kind of G&A cost savings, right? So I think figuring that out today. One of the big elements in this that we haven't discussed is, I do paper records, I do electronic records, maybe I do both. How does that work into the equation? That actually becomes the basis of how you calculate those cost savings, because I think a lot of people understand on a base level that the electronic is probably more efficient, it's probably more cost effective, but they don't really know how to communicate exactly how in a tangible way. So one of the things we learned early on is we started collecting metrics on what we think it costs us to manage paper day to day, right? So if you take it back to the records management fundamentals and frame it within that context, you can easily create a scorecard that kind of captures the different life cycles. And this is what we landed on after trying many different things. So you do your capture, store, access, maintain, and destroy or dispose. A&D is obviously the big dispose part, so that's where you're going to get a lot of that information out of. But you literally say, what does it cost us to capture information. So whether that's, paper sent to your department and you're filing it, or you're imaging it, or maybe you're capturing it at source, what does that cost per unit or per document? And then figure that out. And that may be a time trial, right? How long does it take us from when it's sent from the business to when we've fully processed it?
How do you find the time to start doing that?
Well, you just really got to be thinking about what you're doing each day and say, like, if somebody asked me, what do you do and what value are you adding to the company? Most people would just be saying, oh, I don't know, I do this. And then you'd start going into this great big description of what you do, which they really don't care about. You don't take personally, but they don't. And you're thinking, well, if they're living in a world of dollars and cents, how do I translate what I'm doing into something that they understand and they can appreciate and say, yeah, that's great. So it's really doing that on a day-to-day basis.
Which is really, over the last few years with the economy going down, and we've seen the decimation of information management teams because we just can't, and we have this same issue as a vendor, just trying to kind of work and talk to the clients to try and develop and build what that value is. And then how do you communicate that? How do we even have a conversation with a senior level manager, even without any of that internal information, just to even start somewhere?
This is probably your most critical piece. I mean, a lot of people spend their time focusing on technology. Technology changes so fast that there's no long-term value in that, right? You really need to be focusing on business process, educating other people, but also educating yourself on where do I fit into this business process. So it's less about being a service, less about being that administrative other, and more about integrating yourself into their day-to-day workflow so that you're an integral part of that can't be taken out, right? So make yourself kind of indisposable. I think information itself is already in that position, so why aren't we taking advantage of that? Position yourself so that you're there, and then what you're really doing is working out your formula for demonstrating, here's where I fit in, here's where I'm saving costs. Oh, and by the way, you're part of that too because we're integrated, so I'm going to share these cost savings with you, and now you can report that to your management, and now we feel like a partner.
And we've had many conversations where you just start to get engaged. You start to have those conversations, whether it's over coffee or having lunch with some folks from the business units. And as the information management professional, you can start to pick out even just simple things that maybe you could help achieve change that can, at the end, drive big results.
Yeah, the moment that you can see it click with them that this is what's in it for me and this is how I can take what you're doing and make it part of my success, that's when you see the shift. That's the moment that you got to hit people at.
And it's still hard. I mean, even though you've got the experience and you've kind of gone through some of these things and you've learned these lessons, it's still difficult to put together that ROI up front before you actually take action. Like going from physical to digital is you really don't get that full ROI until I think post completion, and then you really can start to collect metrics.
Yeah, I think our biggest learning is that ROI is never done. I think a lot of people think of ROI as the upfront business case to do something. That's just the first stage. The second stage is monitoring possibly that transition from paper to electronic. What's it costing me to do this same function in each format? And then even after that, it continues on to say, here's how we're managing things in electronic and here's the cost savings. Then you start to delve more into, or less the format, more into the process. There's always opportunities where you can tweak your process. We're always learning every day. We're constantly coming up with new ways of doing things. And when you make that transition into the electronic world, you see things completely different. There's a whole new set of opportunities that people aren't even thinking of yet. And as long as you can demonstrate that you're on that trajectory of making things consistently more efficient and therefore saving more costs, then it's all good, right? You're not stagnating. The business sees the value in that and they support you in that.
So Miles keeps stealing everything I'm going to say. So basically, on a day-to-day basis, look for those opportunities. And once you open your eyes and start looking around and kind of lifting up, you will see them. Look for opportunities to build relationships with the business, better understand their workflow, educate about the value, and using those metrics, or even if metrics are not there, the value of information management and why it's an asset and why people need to look at it. Think about storytelling, and whenever you think about storytelling, always think about it from the perspective of the person that you want to tell the story to, because that what's in it for me, why is this important, why should I care, is critical. Secondly, I'd say make sure that you are looking for and leveraging the champions that already exist in your organization. You have people who are informally doing stuff around records management and information management, and maybe and you may not know who those people are, and lots of times those are those admin people, those project managers. Tap into that group because they will help you share the message. You cannot do this alone. You are very lean. You need some help doing that. And I would also say, back to what David talked about, is think about that executive sponsor. What's the governance? Who is at that senior level visibly supporting the importance of records management and talking about records management as a corporate asset?
I think, Lisa, part of the issue, and this came up in conversations in the playbook for development, is there isn't that senior level person. There isn't that person, I guess, that has the history or has the knowledge, experience to say, yeah, as a senior level person, I want to drive change in how we manage our information.
So think about tapping into those people that, by their nature of their role, would naturally be bent towards some of this area. So whether that's CFO, who are used to financial obligations and due diligence, or whether that's the regulatory or the legal counsel, look for that, start to build that relationship. And I think that's a way to start to get that representation at the right level.
David, is there any kind of tips or key words or key kind of conversation or sentences that might kind of help some of these folks get that engagement?
Yeah, the biggest thing and probably the hardest thing that I'm going to tell you is you have to be able to look into the future. I think that the real key to success in any A&D is a lot of people, I would say, do things quite well in terms of understanding the records and data about what problem they're going to solve today. The biggest challenge I'm going to give to you is how well are you able to look into the future? And I'm going to give you one example. So you're dragging me into the records management world. I'm going to drag you into the accounting world for a sec. So,
Fair is fair.
Yeah. So you think that's dry? Wait till you get to accounting. So IFRS 16, real briefly, is a leasing standard. Leases obviously involves contracts and a lot of data and records management. It is happening starting in January 1st, 2019. In essence, what's going to happen from an investor relations perspective is, on average, currently all the leases, the way they are portrayed in the financial statements, they sit on the income statement. What's going to happen is they're going to be moved to the balance sheet. That's a very significant change that's going to happen. So in any A&D situation, you're going to bring in all those contracts and leases into a new company. You're going to have to assess that data, not starting tomorrow, not in 17, not in 18, but in 19. So what we're trying to help companies is, because all that contract and data information, first of all, sits in a whole bunch of different business units. Anybody from G&A to leasing a photocopier to computers, IT to heavy equipment, to operations, to environmental. It's all over the company. So the biggest challenge we have in helping companies bring into the new leasing standard is get their hands around where all the contracts are. So what was an expense today is now going to be an asset tomorrow, is a very difficult challenge for companies. So what we're pushing companies is to do is to try and look into the future, to try and find a system. And I agree with what Miles says, is that technology is an enabler to this process for leases. So we have one client that has 30,000 contracts that they have to go through to assess the leasing standard. The technology we're using around OCR, which is ocular character recognition, is going to go through those contracts to get the information so we can assess it from a leasing standard. But the process about how the records are managed and how people are going to have access to actually assess the problem that they have is actually more key to solving the problem. So I hope you all have crystal balls, because that's what you're going to need. But I think if you really want to be impactful in an A&D situation, or around this whole, you have to be able to look at what's going to happen in the future, not only in your department but in others.
Well, and that kind of leads into a lot of discussions that came up at the end of the playbook development, not just on the A&D side, but land in general, and the types of deals over the last couple of years that have been kind of happening, and the complexities of those deals, and the, dispersion of risk, and you're getting just pieces of assets, and trying to manage that information. Or if you're divesting, what are you supposed to hand over? If you're acquiring, what are you supposed to get? And then actually within that land group or the information management group, how do you manage that documentation? How do you manage the money? Very crucial, and actually is we're already actually working on that piece as a revision to our playbook today. Certainly the joint venture JAI world is entitlement, I think, is what kind of a word that seemed to come up a lot of the time when we were talking about it. Really look at the entitlement piece within the corporation as to what you're entitled to in those assets, and then how do you manage the information through that. So that is going to be coming out in a short while, so please have a look at the revision that'll be coming out. Do we have to kind of wrap up here? I know we can, as we did in the development of the playbook, we could talk about this stuff all day long, and trying to give something for everyone to take away is difficult at times. But thank you very much for the three of you to join us today and take part and share your knowledge. Greatly appreciated. I guess that wraps up the breakfast and the talk. Thanks, folks.